The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Morrison's carefully tended garden as he slowly bent down to pull a stubborn weed from between his prized tomato plants. At 93, his movements weren't as quick as they used to be, but his eyes were still sharp, and his mind even sharper. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he straightened up, his weathered hands brushing dirt from his old blue gardening pants. Frank had lived in this quiet suburban house on Maple Street for over 50 years. It was the same house where he and his late wife Martha had raised their 2 children, and where he now spent his retirement days following a simple but meaningful routine. The neighbors all knew him as the friendly veteran who always had time to share a story or offer a piece of hard candy to their children. Every morning, like clockwork, Frank would wake up at 6 o'clock a.m. He would make his coffee the old-fashioned way, using the same metal pot he'd had since the 1970s. The familiar smell would fill his kitchen as he sat at his small wooden table, reading yesterday's newspaper that his neighbor Jimmy always brought over. Frank didn't care much for computers or smartphones. He preferred things he could hold in his hands. His house wasn't fancy, but it was home. Pictures of his family covered the walls, including his most prized possession, a black and white photograph of his military unit from World War II. He would often stop and look at it, remembering the faces of friends long gone. Some days, he would wear his old military medals while telling stories to the neighborhood children who gathered on his porch after school. The local kids especially loved hearing about how he had helped save 3 of his fellow soldiers during a dangerous mission in 1945. Frank never bragged about his medals or his service, but he believed in sharing these stories to help young people understand the importance of friendship and bravery. Today started like any other day. After his morning coffee and garden work, Frank put on his favorite brown sweater and settled into his worn leather armchair on the front porch. He had just opened his book, a history novel about World War II that his granddaughter Sarah had given him, when he heard it. The deep, rumbling sound of motorcycle engines in the distance. At first, Frank didn't think much of it. Motorcycles sometimes passed through the neighborhood, though not often, but this time the sound grew louder and didn't fade away. Instead, it seemed to be getting closer to his quiet street. Soon, a group of 5 motorcycles turned onto Maple Street. Their chrome parts gleamed in the sunlight as they rolled past Frank's house, the riders dressed in leather jackets covered with patches and logos. They stopped at the empty lot across from Frank's home, their engines still roaring loudly. Frank watched as more motorcycles joined the group. Some of the riders were talking and laughing, while others revved their engines, creating a noise that made his windows rattle. Mrs. Peterson, his next-door neighbor, quickly brought her small dog inside, giving Frank a worried look as she hurried past. The peaceful morning he had enjoyed just moments ago was now filled with the sound of loud engines and rough laughter. Frank's hands gripped his book tighter as he watched more bikers arrive. His quiet street was becoming a gathering spot for what looked like an entire motorcycle club. A few of the younger neighborhood children who usually played on the sidewalk quickly ran home, scared by the loud noise and rough-looking newcomers. Frank felt a deep sadness as he watched them go. This street had always been a safe place for everyone, young and old alike. As the morning wore on, Frank couldn't focus on his book. The constant noise made it impossible to enjoy his usual peaceful reading time. He noticed some of the bikers looking his way, pointing and smirking. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard, revved his engine extra loud while staring directly at Frank's porch. Frank slowly stood up from his chair, his joints creaking in protest. As he walked inside his house, he took one last look at the growing crowd of bikers. For the first time in many years, he felt uncertain about what was happening in his beloved neighborhood. The quiet street where he had spent so many peaceful days was changing, and not for the better. Little did Frank know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone in the neighborhood. The next few weeks brought unwelcome changes to Maple Street. The motorcycle club had made Frank's quiet neighborhood their regular meeting place, showing up almost every day. The peaceful afternoons that Frank once enjoyed on his porch became impossible as the bikers grew bolder and more disruptive. One particularly warm Tuesday afternoon, Frank decided he needed to speak up. He had spent the morning watching the neighborhood children avoid playing outside because of the noise and intimidating presence of the bikers. His old military training had taught him that sometimes you had to face problems head-on. Walking slowly but with purpose, Frank made his way across the street. His back was straight, just like in his army days, though his steps weren't as steady as they used to be. As he got closer, he could see the details of the bikers' leather jackets, covered with patches and symbols he didn't understand. "Excuse me," Frank said politely, his voice clear despite his age. "I was hoping we could talk about the noise level. You see, this is a family neighborhood, and—" Before he could finish, one of the younger bikers cut him off with a loud laugh. "Look what we got here, boys. Grandpa wants us to keep it down." The man revved his engine loudly, causing several others to laugh and do the same. The leader of the group, a tall man with a gray beard who called himself Snake, stepped forward. He towered over Frank, his arms crossed over his chest. "Listen, old-timer, public street means public space. We ain't breaking any laws." Frank stood his ground, remembering times when he had faced much scarier situations during the war. "I understand that," he said calmly, "but there are families here, young children who—" "Maybe it's time for you to find a retirement home, Gramps," another biker called out, causing more laughter from the group. "This ain't the 1940s anymore." The mention of the 1940s stung Frank more than he showed. He noticed one of the bikers pointing at his old military service pin that he always wore on his sweater. "Hey, look at that, he's some kind of war hero," the biker said mockingly. "Bet those medals don't help you sleep at night, do they, old man?" Frank felt his hands shake slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "I just asked that you show some respect for the neighborhood," he said, turning to walk away as the sound of revving engines followed him. The next few days got worse. The bikers seemed to take special pleasure in making noise whenever they saw Frank. They would rev their engines extra loud when passing his house, and sometimes they would circle the block multiple times late at night, their motorcycles echoing through the quiet streets. One morning, Frank found empty beer cans in his garden, crushing some of his favorite flowers. Later that week, someone knocked over his mailbox during the night. His neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, offered to call the police, but Frank refused. He had seen enough conflict in his life to know that sometimes fighting back only made things worse. The lack of peace began to affect Frank's health. He started having trouble sleeping, jumping at every loud noise. His hands would shake when he tried to read his morning newspaper, and he stopped sitting on his porch altogether. The neighborhood children no longer came by to hear his stories, and his beloved garden started to show signs of neglect. Sarah, Frank's granddaughter, noticed the change in him during her weekly visit. She found him sitting in his dark living room, looking tired and defeated. The usual sparkle in his eyes was gone, replaced by a worried look she had never seen before. "Grandpa, you need to do something about this," Sarah said, concerned about how thin and pale he looked. "This isn't right. They can't treat you this way." Frank just shook his head slowly. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the hardest battles are the ones you fight in your own home." He looked out his window at the group of bikers gathering across the street, their loud laughter carrying through the glass. That night, as Frank lay in bed listening to the distant rumble of motorcycles, his heart started racing uncomfortably. The stress of the past weeks, combined with his age, had taken its toll. As he clutched his chest, trying to catch his breath, he realized this situation had become more than just a nuisance. It was becoming dangerous. Little did the bikers know, their actions were about to lead to a series of events that would change everything, starting with a late-night emergency that would force everyone to see things in a very different light. That night changed everything. The sound of sirens cut through the darkness as an ambulance raced down Maple Street, its red lights flashing against the houses. Inside Frank's home, paramedics worked quickly to help the elderly veteran who was having severe chest pains and difficulty breathing. Mrs. Peterson had found him. She had noticed his kitchen light on at an unusual hour and heard something fall when she was letting her dog out. Following her instincts, she used the spare key Frank had given her years ago and found him on the kitchen floor, struggling to breathe. Panic attack combined with extreme stress, one of the paramedics explained as they loaded Frank into the ambulance. At his age, this could be very serious. The neighbors gathered on their porches, watching with worried faces as the ambulance drove away. Even some of the bikers, who had been hanging around late that night, fell silent as they watched the scene unfold. Sarah received the call at 2 a.m. She rushed to Memorial Hospital, her hands shaking as she parked her car. The emergency room was quiet except for the beeping of machines and the soft footsteps of nurses. She found her grandfather in a small room, looking smaller and more fragile than she had ever seen him. "The doctor says it was a severe panic attack," the nurse explained to Sarah. "His blood pressure was dangerously high. They'll need to stay here for a few days of observation. Sarah sat beside her grandfather's bed, holding his rough, weathered hand. Frank opened his eyes slowly, looking embarrassed to be seen in this state. "I'm sorry to worry you, sweetheart," he said softly. "I didn't want to cause any trouble." "Grandpa," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady, "why didn't you tell me how bad things had gotten? Mrs. Peterson says you haven't been sleeping or eating properly for weeks." She noticed how his hospital gown seemed too big for him, how much weight he had lost. Frank looked out the hospital window, his eyes distant. "You know, in the war, we were taught to handle our own problems. Not to complain." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "But this is different. Every loud noise brings back memories I thought I had buried. The constant tension that reminds me of waiting for attacks during the war." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as her grandfather, always so strong and independent, finally opened up about his struggles. She learned how he had been skipping meals because he was afraid to work in his garden. How he would lie awake at night, jumping at every motorcycle sound, his heart racing with each rev of an engine. The next morning, more details emerged. The doctors discovered that Frank had been taking his blood pressure medication irregularly because his hands shook too much when the bikers were around. His weight had dropped 15 pounds in just 3 weeks. The hospital staff were amazed by the stream of visitors who came to see Frank. Neighborhood children brought hand-drawn get-well cards. Mrs. Peterson brought his favorite cookies. Even Mr. Thompson, the grumpy owner of the local hardware store, stopped by with flowers. Sarah watched all this with growing anger. She had already called the police twice about the bikers, but since they weren't technically breaking any laws, nothing had been done. She began documenting everything, taking photos of the disruptions, recording the noise levels, and gathering statements from neighbors. "I'm filing a formal complaint," she told her grandfather firmly. "This has to stop. You fought for this country. You shouldn't have to live in fear in your own home." Frank listened to his granddaughter's plans from his hospital bed, but something else was forming in his mind. As he watched the sunset through his hospital window, he remembered something his old commanding officer used to say: "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting back, it's finding a new way forward." That evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave, a young nurse came in to check Frank's vital signs. As the nurse leaned over to take his blood pressure, Frank noticed something familiar about his face. The nurse wore a small pin on his uniform, one that Frank recognized immediately. It was then that Frank had an idea, one that would change everything. But first, he needed to get better. And as he drifted off to sleep that night in the hospital, Frank Morrison began to form a plan that would surprise everyone, especially the bikers who thought they had won. Frank spent 3 days in the hospital, getting stronger each day. On the morning of his 4th day there, the young nurse who had caught his attention came in early for his shift. As he checked Frank's vital signs, Frank finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "That pin you're wearing," Frank said, pointing to the small metal badge on the nurse's uniform. "It's the 101st Airborne Division insignia, isn't it?" The nurse, whose name tag read Mike, looked surprised. "Yes, sir, it was my brother Tommy's. He served in Afghanistan." Mike's voice grew quiet. "He didn't make it back." Frank's eyes widened. "Tommy Martinez?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Your brother wasn't Tommy Martinez, was he?" Mike stared at Frank in shock. "How did you know my brother's name?" Frank reached for his wallet on the bedside table, his hands shaking as he pulled out an old folded photograph. In it, a much younger Frank stood next to a smiling soldier. "I met Tommy at a veterans event 5 years ago," Frank explained. "We spent hours talking about the 101st. He reminded me so much of my old war buddies." Mike sat down heavily in the chair next to Frank's bed, looking at the photograph with tears in his eyes. "Tommy talked about you. You're the World War II vet who told him about the Christmas Eve rescue mission in 1944. As they talked, Mike shared more about his brother and his own life. He mentioned that he volunteered at the local veterans center on weekends. Then he said something that changed everything. "You know those bikers who've been causing trouble in your neighborhood?" Mike asked. "I recognize some of them from the Veterans Center. Many of them served in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're struggling, just like Tommy was." Frank listened as Mike explained how several of the bikers were combat veterans dealing with PTSD. The motorcycle club had become their way of coping with civilian life. the loud engines, the group solidarity. It helped them feel in control, just like the military had. James the Snake Williams, their leader, Mike continued, he was a Marine. Lost his entire squad in an ambush. The only reason I know is because he came into the ER last month after a panic attack, just like yours. Frank lay back against his pillows, processing this new information. He thought about how the biker's behavior reminded him of some of his own war buddies who had struggled to adjust after coming home. The noise, the aggressive behavior, it was all too familiar. Later that day, Sarah visited with some paperwork she had prepared for a legal complaint against the bikers. She found her grandfather deep in thought. Sarah, Frank said, stopping her as she began to explain the documents. I need you to hold off on filing those papers. I think I understand something now that I didn't before. He told her about his conversation with Mike, about the bikers being veterans, about their struggles that mirrored his own from so many years ago. Sarah listened, her expression changing from confusion to understanding. You know, Frank continued, after World War II, I was angry too. I made a lot of noise, caused trouble. It was the older vets from World War I who helped me find my way back. Maybe, he paused, looking out the window, maybe history's giving me a chance to do the same. That evening, as Frank prepared to leave the hospital, Mike stopped by one last time. They talked more about Tommy, about war, and about healing. Frank asked questions about the Veterans Center and the kinds of support available for modern veterans. As Mike helped Frank into the wheelchair for hospital policy's discharge procedure, Frank made a decision that would surprise everyone. He wasn't going to fight the bikers, and he wasn't going to run away. He had a different plan, one that would draw from his own experiences of war and peace. Walking out of the hospital with Sarah, Frank felt stronger than he had in weeks. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest discoveries come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, your enemies are really just friends you haven't met yet. A week after returning home from the hospital, Frank sat in his living room, surrounded by old photo albums and military memorabilia. Sarah had tried to convince him to stay with her family, but he had insisted on coming back to his house. He had a plan, and he needed to be home to make it work. That morning, Frank made 2 important phone calls. The first was to Mike at the Veterans Center, asking for advice and information. The second was to his old friend Bill Thompson, who owned the largest garage in town. By afternoon, Frank had everything he needed to put his plan into action. "Grandpa, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, helping Frank organize some old military photographs on the coffee table. "These are the same people who caused your panic attack. Maybe we should just go ahead with the legal papers." Frank shook his head, carefully pinning his service medals to his best jacket. "Sometimes, Sarah, the bravest thing you can do is to reach out to those who seem to be your enemies." He picked up an old brass compass from his war days, turning it over in his hands. "These young men are lost, just like I was once." Around 4 p.m., when the bikers usually gathered, Frank heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. Instead of staying inside, he walked out to his front porch and waited. As the group gathered across the street, Frank took a deep breath and began walking toward them. The bikers noticed him approaching. Some revved their engines, while others exchanged confused looks. Snake, their leader, stepped forward with his arms crossed, ready for another confrontation. "Mr. Williams," Frank said clearly, addressing Snake by his real name. The biker's eyes widened in surprise. "I'm not here to complain. I'm here to make you an offer." The bikers fell silent, curiosity replacing their usual hostility. Frank pulled out an old photograph from his jacket pocket and held it out to Snake. It showed a young Frank with his military unit. "I know about Iraq," Frank said quietly, so only Snake could hear. "I know about your squad." Snake's tough expression faltered for a moment. "And I know what it's like to carry those memories alone." Frank spoke louder now, addressing the whole group. "My friend owns the largest garage in town. He's offered to let us use it as a meeting space, 3 times a week, a place where veterans can gather, work on bikes, and talk if they want to." He paused, looking around at the surprised faces. No judgments, no pressure. Just a space for people who understand. Snake stared at Frank for a long moment. "Why would you do this?" he asked, his voice gruff but uncertain. "After everything we did?" Frank smiled slightly. "Because 50 years ago, I was you. Making noise, causing trouble, trying to drown out the memories. He gestured to his house. An old World War I vet helped me find my way back then. Maybe it's time I passed that kindness forward. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft rumble of idle engines. Then, from the back of the group, a younger biker stepped forward. "I served in Afghanistan," he said quietly. Others began to nod, some murmuring about their own service. Snake looked at his fellow bikers, then back at Frank. The old veteran stood straight and calm, his medals glinting in the afternoon sun. Finally, Snake extended his hand. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow," Frank replied, shaking Snake's hand firmly. "And bring your tools. Bill's got some classic bikes that need work." As Frank walked back to his house, he heard Snake giving orders to his group about respecting quiet hours and keeping the noise down. Sarah, who had watched everything from the porch, hugged her grandfather tightly. "You know," Frank said, watching the bikers prepare to leave, this time without their usual revving and noise. "Sometimes the best way to fight is to stop fighting altogether." That evening, the first time in weeks, Frank sat peacefully on his porch. The street was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the quiet of understanding, of bridges being built, of healing beginning to take place. And in that moment, Frank knew he had made the right choice, not just for himself, but for a new generation of veterans who, like him, just needed someone to show them the way home. The first meeting at Bill Thompson's garage was set for Saturday morning. Frank arrived early, his hands trembling slightly as he arranged folding chairs in a circle. Old military photos and flags decorated the walls, carefully placed there by Frank and Sarah the night before. At exactly 10 a.m., the sound of motorcycles filled the air, but this time, the noise didn't make Frank nervous. He stood at the garage door, watching as Snake led his group into the parking lot. The bikers looked different today, less intimidating, almost uncertain as they parked their bikes in neat rows. "Welcome to our first meeting," Frank said, gesturing to the open garage door. Inside, beside the chairs, stood an old Harley-Davidson motorcycle covered with dust. Bill had found it in his storage area, untouched for years. Snake whistled when he saw the bike. "That's a 1945 Dual A," he said, walking around it slowly. "Military issue. They used these in World War II. Frank smiled. "This one's seen better days. Thought maybe we could work on it together." He patted the old motorcycle's seat. "It was just like this one that saved my life in France." The bikers gathered around as Frank began to tell his story. He described how his unit's motorcycle messenger had carried crucial information through enemy lines, saving dozens of lives. As he spoke, the younger veterans started sharing their own stories. About modern military vehicles, about missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, about friends they'd lost. Mike from the hospital joined them, bringing coffee and donuts. He shared more about his brother Tommy, and soon others were opening up about their own struggles with returning to civilian life. The tough exterior of the bikers began to soften as they realized they were among people who truly understood. "The noise," one young biker named Jason admitted quietly. "Sometimes it's the only thing that drowns out the memories." Others nodded in agreement. "I understand," Frank replied, sharing how he used to slam doors and create chaos after the war, anything to keep the silence at bay. But there are better ways to find peace, ways that don't hurt others or ourselves. As weeks passed, the garage meetings became a regular event. The bikers brought tools and parts for the old Harley, working together to restore it. While their hands were busy with repairs, their tongues loosened and stories flowed more easily. Frank taught them old mechanical tricks he'd learned during the war, while they showed him modern repair techniques. Snake, who had been a mechanical engineer in the Marines, took special interest in the project. His knowledge of engines matched Frank's historical experience perfectly. The transformation was gradual but remarkable. The bikers began showing up at Frank's house, not to cause trouble, but to help with his garden or fix things around his property. They discovered that Snake had a talent for carpentry, and soon he was helping Frank build new garden boxes. The neighborhood noticed the change. Children who had once run away from the bikers now watched curiously as they worked on the old motorcycle. Mrs. Peterson brought homemade cookies to the garage meetings, and other neighbors started dropping by to chat. One sunny afternoon, as Frank supervised Snake and Jason working on the Harley's engine, he overheard two bikers talking quietly about their nightmares, sharing coping strategies they'd learned in therapy. Frank smiled, remembering his own healing journey decades ago. The most surprising change came when the bikers started holding their regular meetups in the parking lot of a local coffee shop instead of Frank's street. When they did ride past his house, they were careful to keep their engines quiet, often waving to Frank as they passed. Sarah visited one Saturday to find her grandfather in the garage, surrounded by leather-clad bikers who were listening intently as he shared stories about his war experiences. She watched as these men, who had once caused her grandfather so much distress, now treated him with respect and admiration. "You see, sweetheart," Frank told her later, his eyes twinkling, "sometimes when you build a bridge, you find that people are just waiting for a way to cross it." The old Harley was slowly coming back to life, but more importantly, so was the spirit of brotherhood that Frank remembered from his own military days. In helping these younger veterans find their way, he had found a new purpose for himself. 3 months after the first garage meeting, Maple Street had become a very different place. The old Harley-Davidson motorcycle, once covered in dust, now gleamed in the sunlight outside Bill's garage. But the transformation of the bike was nothing compared to the changes in the community itself. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, the sound of motorcycles would roll gently into the neighborhood. The bikers, who once terrorized the street, now parked their bikes carefully and gathered not just for meetings, but to help wherever they were needed. One sunny morning, Mrs. Peterson watched in amazement as Snake and 3 other bikers built a wheelchair ramp for old Mr. Johnson across the street. The former Marine's carpentry skills had become well known in the neighborhood, and he took pride in using them to help others. "If you told me 3 months ago that I'd be asking those bikers for help, I wouldn't have believed it," Mrs. Peterson told Frank as they watched from his porch. "Now I feel safer knowing they're around." She was right. The bikers had become unofficial guardians of the neighborhood. When a series of car break-ins started happening in nearby streets, the motorcycle club organized night patrols. The crime stopped within a week. The garage meetings had grown too. What started as a small group of veterans now included soldiers from all over the city. Some drove for hours just to attend. They came not only to work on motorcycles but to find the understanding and support they couldn't get anywhere else. Frank's role had evolved as well. The local newspaper ran a story about him, titled "The Veteran Who Built Bridges." The article described how a 93-year-old World War II veteran had transformed a conflict with bikers into a community support network. One day, a van from the local TV station parked outside the garage. The reporter wanted to do a story about their unique veterans group. Frank watched proudly as Snake explained to the camera how working on the old Harley had given them all a sense of purpose. "It's not just about fixing motorcycles," Snake said, his usual gruff voice softening. "It's about fixing ourselves. Mr. Morrison showed us that." The tough biker actually had tears in his eyes as he spoke, though we tried to hide them. The children of the neighborhood, who had once been scared of the bikers, now gathered eagerly when they arrived. The bikers taught them about motorcycle safety and basic mechanics. Some even helped the kids fix their bicycles, showing the same patience that Frank had shown them. Sarah noticed the biggest change in her grandfather. His hands no longer shook when he heard motorcycles. Instead, his eyes would light up as he recognized the familiar sounds of his friends arriving. His garden flourished again, now tended not just by him but by a rotating group of volunteer bikers who had discovered they enjoyed the peaceful work. The local Veterans Affairs office took notice. They sent representatives to observe the garage meetings, amazed at how effectively Frank's informal approach was helping veterans adjust to civilian life. Several other neighborhoods in nearby cities asked Frank to help them set up similar programs. One particularly special moment came when the restored Harley roared to life for the first time. Snake insisted that Frank should be the first to ride it. The old veteran sat proudly on the motorcycle while everyone gathered around, their phones recording the historic moment. "Never thought I'd see the day," Bill Thompson said, watching the scene in his garage. "These boys were the terror of the neighborhood. Now look at them, they're its heart." The transformation spread beyond just the veterans. Other neighbors began joining the Saturday meetings, bringing food and sharing stories. The garage became a place where the whole community could come together, breaking down barriers between generations and backgrounds. Even the local police department changed their attitude. The same officers who had once received complaints about the bikers now stopped by the garage regularly, sometimes joining in the conversations and sharing their own military experiences. Frank often sat in his favorite chair, watching all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction. He saw how Snake would welcome new veterans to the group with the same gentleness that Frank had shown him. He watched young bikers learning to channel their energy into helping others instead of causing trouble. "You've started something amazing here," Sarah told her grandfather one evening, as they watched the sun set over the now peaceful street. "You didn't just help the bikers, you helped the whole community find its heart." 1 year after Frank's first meeting with the bikers, Maple Street hosted a special celebration. The entire neighborhood gathered in and around Bill's garage, which had been decorated with flags, balloons, and a large banner reading "Veterans Supporting Veterans, 1 year anniversary." The old Harley-Davidson motorcycle, now fully restored, held a place of honor in the center of the garage. Next to it stood a framed photo showing Frank and Snake shaking hands on that first day when everything changed. The picture had become famous after the local news story went viral online. Frank, now 94, sat in a comfortable chair as people came to congratulate him. He looked healthier and happier than he had in years. The stress lines that had marked his face during the troubled times had softened into smile lines. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Sarah asked her grandfather, watching as Snake organized a group of bikers who were setting up tables for the celebration. Frank smiled, shaking his head. "Sometimes the best things in life come from our biggest challenges," he replied, his eyes twinkling. "We just have to be brave enough to see the opportunity." The garage had become much more than just a meeting place. With support from the local government and veterans organizations, it was now officially recognized as the Morrison Veterans Support Center. 3 other cities had already started similar programs, using Frank's model of bringing older and younger veterans together. During the celebration, Snake stepped forward to make a special announcement. "When we first met Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "we thought he was just an old man who didn't understand us. Now we know he understood us better than we understood ourselves." Snake unveiled a new sign for the center. Below the name was a new motto: "Building Bridges Across Generations." The crowd applauded as Frank wiped tears from his eyes. The transformation had spread far beyond their small community. A national veterans organization had featured their story in their magazine. Veterans from across the country wrote letters to Frank, asking for advice on starting similar programs in their own communities. But perhaps the most touching moment came when a group of young veterans arrived from a nearby military base. They had heard about the program and wanted to see it for themselves. Among them was a young soldier who reminded Frank of himself at that age, angry, lost, and looking for purpose. Frank watched as Snake and the other bikers welcomed these newcomers, showing them the same patience and understanding that Frank had shown them. The cycle of healing was continuing, passing from one generation to the next. The celebration included a special ceremony where the mayor presented Frank with a key to the city. But what meant more to Frank were the personal stories shared that day. Veterans stood up one by one to talk about how the program had changed their lives. "Before I met Mr. Morrison," one young biker said, "I thought no one could understand what I was going through. Now I know I'm not alone." Others nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears. As evening approached, the bikers surprised Frank with one final gift. They had collected money to create a scholarship fund in his name. The Frank Morrison Veterans Support Scholarship would help veterans pursue education and training. "Your legacy will continue," Snake told Frank, his voice thick with emotion. "Long after we're gone, this scholarship will keep helping veterans find their way home." Looking out at the gathered crowd, bikers, neighbors, veterans young and old, all together as one community, Frank felt a deep sense of peace. The street that had once been filled with tension now rang with laughter and friendship. Sarah leaned down and hugged her grandfather. "You did it, Grandpa," she whispered. "You really did it." Frank smiled, watching as a young veteran admired the restored Harley while Snake explained its history. "No, sweetheart," he replied softly. "We all did it together. That's the real lesson here. When we stop seeing each other as enemies and start seeing each other as family, anything is possible." As the sun set on Maple Street, the sound of motorcycles could still be heard. But now, instead of bringing fear, they brought hope. Frank's story had become more than just a tale of conflict resolved. It had become a blueprint for healing, understanding, and the power of reaching across generations to build a better future.